Luis Argueta was born in 1946 in Guatemala City. In 1971, he graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in industrial engineering. Later, he obtained a PhD in cinema and comparative literature. Argueta settled in the U.S. because he was given a good scholarship to attend the University of Michigan and because there were more opportunities for economic growth in the United States than there were back home in Guatemala. He married and settled in New York City, where he later worked. In 1975, Luis Argueta worked as Fernando Arabal's assistant. Arabal is a Spanish screenwriter who wrote El Triciclo, which was later adapted by Argueta as a film. Arabal's play, El Triciclo, was turned into a script and then a screenplay, and was ultimately created as a film. From 1980 to 1989, Argueta worked as a production assistant for Henry Sandbank in New York advertising. Later, he started Morningside Movies Incorporated and produced primarily commercials aimed at Latin American and Spanish-speaking audiences. In 2017, Luis Argueta came to UNI as a speaker.
Luis Argueta is a highly revered and awarded film director and producer. The Guardian listed Mr. Argueta as one of Guatemala's national living icons. He was also awarded the Order of Quetzal in the degree of Grand Officer, which is the highest honor given by Guatemala. And he was the first filmmaker to ever be given this award. The Silence of Nido is the only Guatemalan film to ever have been submitted to the Academy Awards competition, and he is the only Guatemalan director to have received a Clio Award. Abused, the Postville Raid, won Best Documentary Audience Award at a film festival in Finland, Second Prize Audience Award at a Chicago Latin Film Festival, and honorable mention in the 14th International Film Festival in Guatemala.
Guatemala, 1954. In a country torn apart by war, a boy struggles to find his voice. Guided by his free-spirited uncle, he overcomes his fears, faces the pain of loss, travels the uncertain road of adolescence, encounters support and the solidarity of friendship, and finds a way to realize his dreams. The Silence of Nido. The first international film from Guatemala by award-winning director Luis Argueta.
In his film, The Silence of Nido, a young Guatemalan boy with big dreams sees his family's and friends' lives negatively impacted by the U.S. presence in Guatemala during the Cold War. This ultimately results in the death of one of his family members and the rest of them being forced to flee from their homes and leave everything behind.
Postville, Iowa, a little town on the prairie, will never forget May 12, 2008.
Around 10 o'clock this morning, immigration agents surrounded the agri-processors plant in Postville. It's the largest kosher meat packing plant in the country.
ICE agents executed criminal and civil search warrants at the company, resulting in the arrest of 389 undocumented alien workers.
Lines and rows of Hispanic workers on their knees like dogs.
Abused, the Postville Raid, a film about how the rule of law was neglected.
They were expecting us to represent 10 criminal defendants at a time.
The court appeared to be working at the pleasure of the prosecution, bending over backwards in order to accommodate the prosecution. I've never seen that.
How the rights of workers were cast aside.
Like the cattle they worked with at agro-processors were processed through a makeshift judicial assembly line, which was designed to do one thing: convict them of a felony and deport them.
How the Constitution was trampled.
Of the 57 people I sentenced, not one of them had a criminal conviction in the United States, not so much as a misdemeanor conviction. To have 57 people in a row that don't even have a single misdemeanor among them is unheard of in federal court.
How did we ever get to this as a nation?
In Abused, the Postville Raid, the first installment in his immigration trilogy, he follows the story of the biggest, most expensive, and most brutal immigration raid in the United States history. The documentary tells this story through gripping and tragic personal narratives of people and families involved in this event. In his film Abrazos, the second film in the immigration trilogy, he tells the story of 14 U.S. children from Minnesota and follows them on their journey to Guatemala to meet their grandparents and, in some cases, their siblings for the very first time. This showcases the heartache of families being separated by citizenship and seeking better lives somewhere else.
In kindergarten, my teacher turned on the TV, and I saw the buses and the men that were getting carried out with chains.
Around 10 o'clock this morning, immigration agents surrounded the agro-processors plant in Postville. At least 300 workers remain in federal custody tonight.
Y entonces se acercó mi marido y me dijo, no, me dijo, ya nos tienen, me dijo, nomás diga la verdad. Y ya solo eso me dijo, ya no lo vi más.
A mí me pusieron un brazalete, a mis hijos no, entonces no podía hacer nada. Nosotros abríamos la refri y no teníamos nada.
Sinceramente ya había perdido la ilusión y ya mis sueños de que un día regresara yo a Estados Unidos ya se iba a terminar.
So many people across the nation have joined us to help the people in Postville.
Just this feeling that welled up that said, Perio, you have to go to Postville.
Como otra familia para nosotros.
Nos ayudaron a pagar renta, nos ayudaron a pagar biles.
I ended up representing way over 100 clients pro bono.
What has happened to you is a crime in this country. If you help the investigators, they can protect you.
A victim is someone that we fight for regardless of why they're here.
This case is about the children. Bottom line, that's what this case was about.
Porque es romper con el silencio que es el que le da el poder a los abusivos. Y ustedes al hablar le quitan ese poder.
This is going to be quite a ride, and it was.
We got 3 visas approved.
States like Iowa won't tolerate abusive workers, regardless of their legal status.
Después de estar sufriendo y sufriendo, no saber qué va a pasar, todo empezó como a alumbrarse y a ver el futuro más bueno.
In U-Turn, the final film in the immigration trilogy, he tells the story of a group of migrant women and underage workers who broke the silence about the abuses they endured at the hands of the agro-processing plant in Postville, and of the community that would not abandon them afterwards. Luis Argueta has a passion for telling the unheard stories of transnational immigrants, Hispanics, and Native peoples. He gives a voice to the people who otherwise could not be heard, whether that's because of oppression in their countries, citizenship issues, abuse, and the list goes on and on. His movies tend to depict the Latin American culture and its struggle for peace.
The theme of telling unheard Latin American voices ties in well with some of the content we are studying in class. Mainly, the reasons these people would leave Latin America. In class lectures and discussions, we have learned about the Mexican and Guatemalan societies, economies, and political systems. The society in Latin America, specifically Mexico and Guatemala, displays economic disparity, with a majority of the citizens in the lower class barely having enough money to survive, and only the elite upper class having most of the country's wealth. The political system in Mexico is a quote-unquote democracy, but almost all of the elections are rigged with help from the army and police force. These are definite reasons for people who are underprivileged to want to leave Latin America and go somewhere better, usually the US. This makes the themes of Luis Argueta very related to recent course material.
Luis Argueta, in the film Abused, the Postville Raid, gives a voice to the many immigrants, legal and not, that were detained in the Postville Raid. He shows the inhumane method of their treatment. The accounts depict a makeshift detainment unit where hundreds of immigrants were tried and prosecuted in up to groups of 10. The immigrants talk of the brutality, hardships, political pressures, and unethical treatment that they were subject to. The documentary features dramatic reenactments, witness testimonies, court videos, and shots of small-town Iowa life to really paint a human face on the immigration issue. Rather than focusing on numbers and statistics, Argueta uses the power of film to draw sympathy from the viewer. The Silence of Neto shows the more personal side of the turmoil that was Guatemalan politics at the time, which we discussed in class. The film goes to show how U.S. intervention caused even more turmoil than was already there, leaving Neto and his family no choice but to flee. The magic in the movie is Argueta's focus on creating a realistic childhood rather than focusing on the political climate. The politics are shown, but they are through the lens of a child who doesn't completely understand all that is going on around him. The film U-Turn dives into the corporate side of illegal immigration, where big corporations use their power to oppress the vulnerable, powerless, undocumented immigrants of Postville. These immigrants then get a chance to fight back in court against the agri-processing company that mistreated them. The film also emphasizes a new hope for many of the citizens of Postville to get special U visas if they testify. A big difference between Abused and U-Turn is that Luis Argueta is an actual participant in the film and actually influencing what happens. It documents events while they're happening, rather than reenacting them.
Even though I am an immigrant myself and a naturalized American citizen, and I had worked as an intake worker at the Department of Social Services in Michigan during 2 summers while a student at the University of Michigan, where I was able to attend on a full scholarship, I knew very little about enforcement of immigration law until the summer of 2008, when approximately 900 heavily armed agents of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, entered Agri-Processors Inc., the largest kosher slaughterhouse and meatpacking plant in the country, on May 12, 2008, and arrested 389 undocumented workers. I was in a different time, in a different place. I was living in New York City directing 4 episodes for We Are New York, a TV series geared toward recently arrived immigrants in the city. I didn't pay much attention to the event then. However, about a month later, on July 11th, I read Julia Preston's article on the front page of the New York Times, in which she discussed Eric Kamaid Freyshas's essay about his work as an interpreter in the post-raid Postville context. Kamaid Freyshas and 12 other interpreters were hired by the federal government to assist in the legal proceedings following the raid. After reading Preston's article, I went to the link and read Kamaid Freyshas's personal account of his experiences interpreting after what he called the largest ICE raid in U.S. history. And I said, everybody who believes in democracy, everybody in this country, should read this essay. I immediately contacted Kamaid Freyshas and asked him about the rights to publish his essay in Spanish. I then contacted my friend and colleague, Raul Figueroa Sarti, founder and editor-in-chief of F&G Editores, and asked him, if I get the right to this essay, will you publish it? Both Kamaid Freyshas and Figueroa Sarti agreed, and that essay became book number 8 in F&G's series, Cuadernos del Presente Imperfecto.
My next move was to call St. Bridget's Catholic Church, the site widely reported to have been the refuge to thousands of family members of the primarily Mexican and Guatemalan detainees from the raid. I asked them if they could help me set up some interviews with people in Postville affected by the raid. They also said yes. On the morning of July 23, 2008, my friend and co-producer Vivian Rivas and I left for Postville. Our plan was to spend 4 days there, tape a few interviews with the immigrants who were made in town, return to New York, and edit these interviews into short segments for a web series titled And There I Am, documenting silent voices that I had begun a couple years earlier. I undertook the web series project as a result of several visits I had made to the Guatemalan mobile consulate during the time when Rosa Maria Merida de Mora was Guatemala's general consul in New York. I traveled with her to New Bedford in the wake of March 6, 2007 ICE raid on the Bianco factory, where mostly Guatemalan and Mayan undocumented workers were employed to make U.S. military uniforms. These people would tell me their stories on camera. I would excerpt them and post them online. Another time, I interviewed a gentleman at the Guatemalan consulate in New York City who had been brought there by ICE to secure a one-way travel document so he could be deported. Today, the process is done by video conference. I posted his interview under the title Deportee. He was the first future deportee that I met. I was developing an interest in the subject, but I was very ignorant of immigration policies and enforcement practices. My real immigration education began the day I arrived in Postville. My initial interviews included women whose husbands had been sent to jail while they had been sent home with ankle bracelets to wait for a court order that took months to arrive. Children whose mothers were detained and who, afraid that ICE would also detain and deport their children, denied being mothers, and local members of the Postville community who had formed a first response team to support these detained families and the families left behind. Those were my first immigration enforcement lessons. My first visit to Postville included the weekend of July 26th and 27th of 2008. On Saturday, Congressman Luis V. Gutierrez led a Congressional Hispanic Caucus delegation which included Chairman Joe Baca, Congressman Albio Sires, in a visit to Postville to meet with those affected by the raid of May 12th. On the following day, Sunday, July 27th, activists from across the country gathered in Postville for an interfaith service, march, and rally calling for comprehensive immigration reform, family unification, and just labor practices. I met local residents and people from Des Moines, Minneapolis, Chicago, Madison, and even Boston. Nuns, parish priests, Lutheran and Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis, labor organizers, and laypeople. The display of solidarity and the stories I had been hearing, both in Spanish and in English, energized me and made me decide to stay for an extra week. By the end of my first trip to Postville, I realized how complex the story was a paradigm for 21st century U.S. immigration. After that week, I returned again and again and again. I took 29 trips to Postville to gather the material that later would be edited to become my documentary film, Abused, the Postville Raid. I realized that though this intersection of these immigrant stories, the stories of the responses of U.S. businesses that employed and sometimes abused migrants, and the stories of people who accompanied and supported the immigrations, or those that protested their presence in, quote-unquote, the heart of America, I was learning and could teach about immigration. Through telling the story of Postville, I could give the context of the political, historical, and social forces that brought Mexicans and Central Americans north. The interviews I was doing could help me to better understand that context, the raid itself, its aftermath, and the human and workers' rights issues involved. For me, Postville was a small laboratory, a crash course on immigration. By producing a film that recreated my findings, I hope to provide a similar opportunity for a wider public. I did not go to Postville in the summer of 2018 with the intention of doing a documentary. However, the people I met, the immigrant families and the community members who stood in solidarity with them after the Postville raid, touched my heart and changed my life. It is now 10 years after my first trip to Postville, and I am still listening, filming, and replaying the stories of these immigrant families and these courageous community individuals. In doing so, I have found my passion and regained a little bit of my lost humanity.
I grew up in Guatemala, and the fact that most of the immigrant workers in Postville were from Guatemala was a definite attraction. However, I want to represent the immigrant spirit that is timeless and knows no geographical boundaries. I would be happy if people, after seeing my films, can begin to see beyond the hateful rhetoric about immigrants, and that they can open their minds and hearts and look beyond the statistics and contemplate the human face of immigration. If for a second we can look at an immigrant and say, "For the grace of the good, there I go," and walk a mile in the shoes of an immigrant, I would feel fulfilled.